Hi, I'm Ann Boylan. I've just retired from the History Department, and I am one of the co-chairs of the program committee. And the other co-chair is Professor Sharon Neal from chemistry.
Hello, everyone. As Professor Ann Boylan has just said, I'm Sharon Neal from the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. It's important to remember both. And we're thrilled to see all of you. We think we're about a third of the way through registration, many more to come, but we hope that we'll see all of you and those yet to come between now and Sunday afternoon. We've been planning this conference for more than a year, closer to a year and a half, and so we're excited that it's finally here. It's also a little bit surreal, but we planned this conference. We were reading a little bit about what was in the literature on women of color in academia, and one of the studies pointed out that there's a lot of counting going on. We know a lot about the numbers. There's not as much information that gives context to those numbers. Not as much information about the narratives of the women those numbers represent. And so our goal as we organized this conference was to have the kind of events you typically expect at a conference, to have panels, to have round table discussions, to have a poster session, to have lots of great keynote talks from names that you probably have heard of before. But we also wanted to have a special emphasis on the lived experience of women of color academics. We wanted our own voices and our experiences to be highlighted and emphasized as a step toward closing that gap between the quantitative and qualitative information available to those who want to understand this phenomenon and advance and promote the careers of women of color academics in all fields. Advance is an NSF-funded activity, so there is a focus on, in the Advance program on women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But this conference understands that there are commonalities in all of our experience, and the input of women of color in all fields, whether STEM or not, can give us insight and give us tools that we can use to advance all of our careers. So I hope that as you interact with the other women of color and our allies who are here with us to develop, what's the word I'm looking for, programs and strategies and technologies perhaps that will improve all of our careers, but also the institutions where we work, because we understand that while people like to use that metaphor of the canary in the mine, Dr. Angelou taught us that, the cage bird sings. And we have a contribution to make to our institutions that's not being made and not being recognized fully when we aren't able to advance and develop to our full extent. So we hope that we'll address all of these issues in this conference. We also hope that you'll hear some ideas and get some plans for things that you can do back at your home institution, that it'll keep you connected to us here at the University of Delaware and at the Advanced Institute, but that also that it'll spring new ideas and new opportunities that we haven't even begun to think about. So beginning in just a few minutes with Dr. Barabino's talk and through our viewing of the film, listening to the living thinkers, and through the rest of our keynotes, we hope that you'll be thinking about ways that you can take the ideas that you hear back to your own institutions, and that this focus on finding our own voices and lifting our own voices and making a more indelible contribution on our institutions will be an idea that spreads from this conference and your time with us this weekend. So thank you so much for coming, and now I'm going to get out of the way and let Professor Boylan introduce one of the first of our illustrious administrators that you're going to meet over the weekend.
Thank you, Sharon. And I think we both would like to thank the rest of the program committee. You'll find their names in the back of your program, and many of them are here, working with us over a long period of time to put together this program. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Carol Henderson, who is the Vice Provost for Diversity at the University of Delaware and also a professor in the departments of English and Black American Studies. Dr. Henderson's been with us from the very first day, and being a historian, I checked my facts. So I looked up the date, and we first met on September the 30th, 2014, to talk about this conference and to begin the process of planning. Also present at that meeting was Professor James Jones of the Center for the Study of Diversity and also the Psychology Department, and they have both had our backs all the way along through this entire process, so we're extraordinarily grateful for having that because it enabled us to feel as though we can do this. We can put on a conference and it can be consequential. Dr. Henderson's bio is in your packet and in your bio sheet. It would take me a lot longer than I have to be able to go through all of her accomplishments. So what I want to do is simply say that when I think about Carol Henderson, there's one word that I think enables me to describe her, and that word is fearless. She is fearless in her scholarship, which looks at African American women in many different aspects of literature. She's fearless in her teaching, for which she has won awards, fearless in her service to the institution, and in her commitment to diversity and excellence at all levels of this university and higher education in general. Her bio pretty much tells most of that story, I would say, but it would be hard to convey in simply looking at a list of her accomplishments the ways in which she fearlessly inspires us all. And Sharon Neal quoted Maya Angelou. I'm going to quote Aaron Neville because whenever I hear that song, counting on strength from above, trusting the power of love, we must be fearless, that is in part how I would describe Dr. Henderson, and I think we're extraordinarily lucky to have her here at the university and with us this afternoon, so thank you.
So when you hear someone describe you, that's one of those wow moments. I'm going to remember that. Thank you very much, Anne and Sharon, for your leadership for this conference, but your leadership overall and working with the advanced team in making the experiences of women of color consequential. More than 40 years ago, and 40 years have passed since the 92nd Congress amended the Higher Education Act of 1965, creating Title IX, a legislative provision barring any educational institution or program receiving federal financial assistance from discriminating against or denying benefits to any person based on sex. Intricately tied to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the amended law targeted gender discrimination specifically and has been largely used to regulate high school and collegiate sports, although its legal reach extends to all facets of institutional life. Nonetheless, advances in racial and gender equity at all levels in the academy has moved at a snail's pace. Within administrative and faculty ranks in particular, women of color find a lack of presence and parity with their peers at many of the major universities and colleges in this country. According to statistics from the American Council on Education, women of color held only 7.5% of full-time faculty positions in 2007, and as rank increased, the percentage declined. Only 6.6% of associate professors and only 3.4% of full professors were women of color. Women of color made up 10.6% of the professors in administrative roles in 2007, even though the populations of students of color on most campuses rose to 30% that same year, and at the higher levels of academic administration, the place where I now reside, presidents, provosts, well, I'm not there yet. The numbers are even more troubling. Such lack of diversity affects all developmental levels of institutional life, and academic vision is compromised when college and university leadership or campus culture does not represent or speak to the multiple and complex issues of the population it serves. And what I find is, even though there aren't many of us on campuses, it's amazing how many people can find us for service. On our conference today, Women of Color, What's Next, is an effort to have those salient conversations around those issues unique to the experiences of academic women of color. Discussions that speak to the persistent challenges of underrepresentation, campus climate, faculty-student relationships, tenure and promotion, social class, network allegiance within institutional life, the perils of a not-so-post-racial world within academic curricula, and the anxieties of identity performance for women of color in the academy, where we are presumed incompetent as scholars, teachers, and academic practitioners, and that's not because of our disciplinary unpreparedness on the part of the scholar, because of course we would not have been hired had we not been prepared, but on the part of gatekeepers, sentinels who feel they must protect a perverse version of academic reality that is unfounded in reliable data or principled administrative practices. It is this death by 1,000 cuts that has allowed our academic halls to hemorrhage excellent and talented women of color who refuse to jump over one more arbitrary hurdle, suffer one more humiliating experience, endure one more empty conversation that has no merit. Bell Hooks is right when she says that moving from silence to speech is an act of defiance for the oppressed and the exploited, for those in the struggle and those who act on behalf of those in the struggle. Speaking our truths makes the interiority of our being tangibly present in the dialogue of humanity. The moment is right for a conference such as this. An emerging and increasingly multicultural student population, a more intimate and global world means that we must adapt institutional and educational practices to accommodate our new realities. We must cultivate tangible and holistic ways to begin the slow process of restructuring academic culture to create more inclusive systems and to honor the educational and intellectual intent of university life in all of its wonderful and disparate strands. The work of Advance here at the University of Delaware, the Center for the Study of Diversity, the Center for Teaching, Assessment, and Learning, UD Faculty Success Program, the Office of Equity and Inclusion, our Chief Diversity Advocates, and other participants in the diversity network, including my own office, are creating intentional practices that have institutional impact. Building a true inclusive academic world takes intentional work. We set intentional institutional climate, by implementing best mentoring practices, transforming recruitment and hiring processes, redirecting errant colleagues who help to cultivate toxic department environments, and creating formal and informal support systems for faculty of color who struggle with racist and sexist politics in the classroom. Informal collaboratives as well help to stem the feeling of isolation and marginalization that often accompany being the only African American woman in the department, or the only Latina on the search committee, or the only person of color teaching race and equity in one's department. But building a sustainable framework demands that the norms of an institution, a department, a college change. In changing the core values and educational mission of an institution, make room for the diversity that is intellectually engaging and socially purposeful. And as such, these shifts in ways of thinking transform institutional culture incrementally but steadily, so that faculty of color do not have to defend the merits of their scholarship, justify what peer review means in their specialized journals, or explain why learning about people who are different from ourselves is a necessary and valued skill in an ever-evolving world and is central to understanding our own selves, our own identity. It is hoped that in providing traceable avenues of empowerment, what we will learn at this conference, healing and collaborative sisterhood, this conference will, in scholar Yolanda Flores Neiman words, quote, plant the seeds of change so that future generations of women of color and members of other historically underrepresented groups may have more fulfilling, respectful, and dignified experiences as faculty in the academic world. Indeed, this is the experience we want for all faculty on our campus. And so with that said, I want to thank again Advance and all of the collaborators out of the office of the provost, the president's office. I want to thank the library for putting on a Women of Color exhibit, which is in our library, Morris Library. And as I mentioned before, this conference has created these wonderful conversations where we're thinking about creating, dare I say the name, because we have not gotten her permission to use her name yet, but we're thinking about creating a science day that will honor a woman of color in the science field so that we can think about collaborating with other institutions regionally who will be doing work like we're doing at the same time as it becomes part of our curriculum. I will now introduce, I think this was my job, our keynote speaker. So again, welcome to the University of Delaware, where we're trying to do great things. And as James said, he always says this of me, I'm doing it at warp speed. But the time is now. We've been waiting quite a bit to get it done. So this conference is a wonderful gauge to help with that energy. So you all are done hearing from me. I will now introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Gilda A. Barabino, who is Berg Professor and Dean of the Grove School of Engineering at the City College of New York. She holds appointments in the departments of biomedical engineering and chemical engineering and the Sophia Davis School of Medicine, a brilliant and well-rounded scholar, Prior to joining CCNY, she served as an associate chair for graduate studies and professor in the Wallich the Wallace H. Coulter Department of Biomedical Engineering at Georgia Tech and Emory. And at those other institutions as well, she served in an appointment I have now. She was the Vice Provost for Academic Diversity. So she knows this field well, and she is a noted investigator in the areas of sickle cell disease, cellular and tissue engineering, and race, ethnicity, and gender in science and engineering. She has a BS degree in chemistry from Xavier and a PhD in chemical engineering from Rice University. And you can look in your program and see all of the extensive awards that she has received. And she is the immediate past president of BMES and is the president-elect of AIMBE, which I'm sure you all know what those stand for. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Gilda A. Barabino.
Good afternoon. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here at this conference for women of color. I want to thank the organizers. I want to thank the University of Delaware Advance for their courageousness in holding this conference, for bringing all of you here. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank Dr. Henderson for the fantastic opening. And I hope I can share with you a little bit about what I think about mentoring and career progression. So you'll see from my talk, I'm just going to give you some musings, some things I've been thinking about based on my lived experience, the lived experience of other women of color, and some of the work that we know from the social sciences. So let me start out with the premise of the talk for today. Mentoring is key to successful career progression, yet what constitutes effective mentoring remains elusive, and women of color are less likely to be mentored. So, what's missing? And importantly, and the purpose of this conference, what's next? So I want to start out by telling you a story about one of my own proteges, Sharika Banton. She's a student, a graduate student who works with me now. She joined me at City College. She's currently still enrolled at Georgia Tech. And I want to tell you a little bit about our path. I first met Sharika when I was at Georgia Tech. I had just started. I had just moved there from Northeastern University in 2007. And I had been assigned way more than my fair share of sections, problem-based learning. And these were sections for freshman students for their introduction to biomedical engineering. Sharika stood out. She was in one of the sections that I was facilitating. Of course, the only person of color in her group. But she stood out because of her excellence in everything she did in the group. She was a team leader from the very beginning. And one of the reasons why I reached out to Sharika, I saw myself in her. I saw this strong, talented black woman who I knew did not know what I knew from the experience that I already had. That light in her and that brilliance in so many ways could be beaten down had we not taken care of it. So I knew this. So I approached Sharika and I said, you need to work in my lab. This was in her freshman year. I said, has anybody approached you about doing undergraduate research in their laboratory? And she's like, no, of course not. You need to work in my lab. So I want to tell you a little bit about our journey together. So Sharika started working with me as a freshman. She got every award you could get, the President's Award for Undergraduate Research and so on. When she was ready to apply for graduate school, I said to her, you can go to any school in this country. You will get accepted. You will get fellowships. I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to tell you, you need to stay here and work with me. However, you need to learn. You need to go out there. You need to visit these places. You need to decide for yourself what is right for you. But I'm going to tell you some things you should be looking at and thinking about. And I'm also going to tell you, I don't care which one of those schools that you think about, What's the likelihood that you're going to have an African-American female engineering professor as your mentor? I'm just saying. But think about it. I can't tell you how delighted I was when she decided she got accepted to all of the top schools, including MIT, Stanford. How excited I was when she made her own decision and she decided to stay with me and pursue her graduate studies with me. She also decided that she wanted to not only pursue her studies in biomedical engineering, but she wanted to pursue her interest in policy. I encouraged her to do so. She learned from just talking to other students and other faculty members that I probably was the only faculty member who would have allowed her to pursue her interest in policy, because everyone else, what did they say? Are you kidding me? You can't leave that lab. You need to be in the lab 24/7. So not only has she done excellent in my laboratory, she went off, she got a presidential policy fellowship. And in that fellowship that she received, she won first place for her essay looking at presidential politics and how it relates to science. I mean, she's blazing it. And I share that with you because that is a positive story in a way that there are some positive notes out there, but I have to tell you, the kinds of things that we share with each other in the storytelling, you're going to hear in my comments some themes that are going to resonate over and over again, and themes that you've already heard from Dr. Neal and Dr. Henderson. But when she and I started talking together and sharing our stories together, I learned that her parents were Jamaican immigrants, and her parents, like my parents were not immigrants. My parents were from New Orleans, but our parents pushed the importance of education. There was no doubt that you would go on to college and so on. We learned that we had similar experiences in undergraduate research. We learned that we had similar interests, and I'm interested in policy as well, hence no surprise that I would push her in that direction. But we've learned in our journey together that this is a journey, and it's a difficult one to navigate. But I wanted to share again with you that as an opening story. And now I want to tell you a little bit about things that put things in context for the environment that we're in now. I'd like to refer you to the double bind, you know, this intersectionality of race and gender. Well, there's a report that was out from a meeting in 1975 that was the double bind, the price of being a minority woman in science, and it was held at AAAS, and the written report was published in 1976. Interestingly, when I first came across that report as a new faculty member in 1990, I was reading that report, and I'm like, they could have written that today. And if you read that 1975 report now, you would think it was just written honestly. 35 years later, the group that originally came together in 1975 came together again. They were revisiting the double bind. And there was also a conference, a summit that was held. And that was written up in 2011, and it appears in the Harvard Educational Review. And there's an article that I thought was fantastic, introductory article by Shirley Malcolm of AAAS and her daughter, Lindsay Malcolm. They talk about the double bind, the next generation. And let me share a quote with you from their article. The next generation women, the double-bind daughters, face different challenges from those faced by their mothers. Now it is less about rights versus wrongs and more about support versus neglect. And the support, the kind of things that we need to be successful in the academy, was one of the reasons why I decided for my topic for this conference was to talk about mentoring and career progression. So women of color in the academy, you know from the social sciences, I'm sure you're probably familiar with this term, outsiders within. Our stark underrepresentation, the stereotypes lead to isolation and marginalization and exclusion, and the structural impediments. And when I talk about structural impediments, I'm talking about the systems, the practices and policies, the institutions, the chilly climates, and so on. We know that there's disproportionate service, that women of color carry a heavy burden on their shoulders to service their institutions, to service their communities, and to make the academic environment more inclusive for all students. We know that women of color represent an untapped and talent, and that they're uniquely positioned because of the intersectionality. And of course, the persistent underrepresentation. I'm going to show you an example from my own field, from engineering. This is data taken from the American Society of Engineering Education, their data indicators. And this is 2014 data, some of our most recent data. If you look on the chart, the main point I'm trying to make here, this is the number of engineering faculty across 345 colleges and universities, and it's disaggregated by rank and race and ethnicity. So the bars you can barely see are for racial ethnic populations, and the higher bar, 8,480, represents Caucasians. So you can see the small numbers, and this is all faculty, when we look at race and ethnicity. Now, if we look a little bit further and we look at the female engineering faculty, again separated by race, ethnicity, and by rank. Now, the earlier chart, the higher number was roughly 9,000, approaching 9,000. Now we're talking about approaching 900. So the stark underrepresentation, again, this is an example from engineering, is real. So before I tell you some of my own ideas about what's missing and what's next, I think it's important to provide context and some conceptual frameworks for understanding mentoring for women of color, and career progression in the academy. So let's talk about mentoring. I choose to think of mentoring as a relationship. It's very relational. So if we think about the relationship between the mentor and the protege, mentor often thought of as the one who's more experienced, more senior, and the protege less experienced, less senior. We think about the mentor as providing counseling and guidance. And in my mind, I don't see how you can call yourself a good mentor if there's not some sponsorship. I know people talk about let's talk about the difference between mentoring and sponsorship. Let's talk about mentoring that includes sponsorship. And I also like to bring up the concept of identity. Identity is real. How you are able to see yourself as a scientist or engineer is influenced by race, gender, the context, the environments that we find ourselves in. And I bring up a study that was done by Coloni and Johnson. They are social scientists who actually conducted their study with women of color in science settings. And they followed these women in the classroom and in their outer experiences. They interviewed them, and they also did observations of their interactions with others. They came up with this model for scientific identity formation. And what they said is there's three intersecting components: performance, competence, and recognition. And if you don't have all those three working well together, your identity as a scientist or engineer is disrupted. Interestingly, of those three intersecting components, which one do you think played the strongest role in forming the science or engineering identity? Recognition. So even with competency and good performance, if there's not accompanying that the recognition, and the recognition from other recognized folks who are in the field, recognize others, women, and women of color in particular, have a more difficult time forming that identity. The kind of mentoring that may or may not happen throughout a career can actually impact that identity as well. Mentoring is a relational process that occurs over time in phases, and again, it's a contextual setting. And it could be a mechanism for socialization, for development, and for retention. Of course, you know, mentoring could be informal and formal. It can occur through one-to-one relationships. It could occur in group settings, as peer mentors, for example, and we all need multiple mentors. There's no such thing as a single mentor that would work. And I like to bring up the concept of same or cross race or gender mentoring. We know that the number of women of color in the academy is so small that it would be difficult to say to anyone, well, you know what, you absolutely have to be mentored by someone who shares your background, your race, or your ethnicity, or your gender. However, there is something that's unique and special when there is an opportunity for same race, or same gender, or both, mentoring, and we shouldn't shy away from it. I've had students tell me, and this is sad actually, but I've had students tell me that they were encouraged not to pick me as an advisor because of my lower status in the academy. It's real. Now, as disturbing as that is to hear a student tell me that, can I tell them that that's not true? I can't. But that's the kind of reality that we deal with. The mentoring, and the reason why I shared my story with you about my experience with Sharika Banton, the mentoring for the mentor and the protege, of course, can be mutually beneficial. I learned so much from Sharika every day, and I'm sure those of you who have played the role of mentor can say that about your proteges as well. I like to talk about the intersectionality related to mentoring because we're not in a vacuum. These intersections make a difference, and that's in terms of social statuses, disciplines, individual characteristics, but also those social organizational factors, the structural factors that happen in our systems and in our environments. And I'd also like to bring up the concept and reinforce it a bit of contextualism, because often what's missing, and you heard this earlier in the comments, often what's missing is the context. There are people behind those numbers. There are stories that go with the people. There's much that can be learned from understanding the stories, the narratives, and in women of color's own voices. So this context we need to think about. It's racialized, it's gendered, it's familial. It has things related to our cultural backgrounds that we cannot separate ourselves from. We don't leave our cultures at the door when we enter the academy. The narratives really absolutely can make a difference. And I find that even when you're talking to students, for example, and you're trying to help socialize them into the profession and prepare them for careers, they learn a lot and want to hear about real world experiences. They want to hear what people have done who are in the field. So the storytelling is very important. And too often we are silenced because there are negative ramifications for speaking out. So finding our voices and not being afraid is going to make a difference. And the protege can often be at the center of these narratives when we're talking about effective mentoring. So when we tie this in with career progression, I'd like to introduce you to, if you're not already familiar with it, this term that's called the heroic journey. And what do we mean by the heroic journey? Think about how the academy started. Pretty much in the academy and the systems that we have were driven by majority men. And in the majority male sort of way of looking at things, we often have this, and it's passed on, this sink or swim mentality where the hero is the one who's trying to sink or swim and is moving through that journey, navigating the path. And the mentor is often seen as the heroic helper. So if you can imagine, we have this type of model out there that's been propagated and institutionalized in our systems for years, since the beginning of the academy. How do you think it might be for women of color who are trying to navigate this path in this type of model? And so I say attempts to navigate that path can be perilous, particularly when you're asked to leave your identity and your culture and who you are at the door so that you can fit in and meet those norms that are, in some cases, appearing to be rather arbitrary. But to do that and follow through and have the career success in the academy. So some of the consequences that sometimes are hidden, but for women of color maybe not so much, if you know what I'm talking about in terms of your own experiences, there are things when we have models like this that relate to the manifestations that you see in behaviors like unconscious bias, identity conflict, and challenges to your ability to develop as leaders. So what's missing? And I told you I'm going to share with you some of my musings. So what's missing, I have no particular order for them, but these are some things that let's think about. Let's think about the context that's often missing. Let's think about the cultural shifts that still need to take place for women of color to be successful in their career progression. Let's think about the lack of women leaders in the academy. lack of women of color leaders in particular. Let's think about the need for same race, same gender mentoring and the role that it can play. Again, not saying it's a replacement, but we should have that in addition to, and a way to reinforce and strengthen our experience in the academy. Let's think about more humanistic approaches. See, I posit that if we would just be more civil to one another, if we would just treat each other the way we want to be treated, that alone would make a difference in the academy. It's not necessarily yet another program or funding. Let's just reach out to the human nature, the human characteristics, and let's be more personal in our interactions and have higher quality interactions. I really do want to emphasize the need for our stories in our own words. Too often, there are false narratives, and when people don't want things to change, it's to their benefit to reinforce the false narrative. So how do you move past the false narratives? How do you bust the myths? And there are myths. The idea that we are presumed incompetent is a myth. We continue to work in our own areas as best we can to fight that, but the collective voice is going to make a difference. And I don't know about you, but I don't actually need somebody speaking for me. We are our best advocates. Now, I'm not saying we don't need allies. I'm not saying that at all. But who can advocate better for you and your needs than you advocating for yourself? Again, this concept of sponsorship. We need effective strategies that are actually tailored to the experiences of women of color. There is no one size fits all. And there is no such thing about being colorblind or gender blind. It's real. It's back to the point that I said, we don't get to check who we are at the door. That's real, and you live with it every day. A better understanding. And we, of course, when we do all this together, we can gain trust. And I can't help but share with you a comment that was made at a meeting I was just at. I'm on the NSF, the National Science Foundation Engineering Advisory Committee. And we just had a meeting yesterday, and France Cordova, the director of NSF, was addressing the group. And I asked her some questions about some of the new programming that NSF is putting forward towards broadening participation and inclusion. And they're actually aggressively using the term inclusion more to do a better job of talking about inclusive excellence and so on, and not just the concept of broadening participation. And one of the things that I was asking her about was, how committed are they? Are you in it for the long haul? And how are you going to do it? But one of the things that she mentioned that I thought was interesting, she talked about the problem of the lack of authenticity, of honoring the authenticity of the message. So those who are like maybe fighting in some ways to keep things the same will not recognize the authenticity of the message being brought by people from different backgrounds, people from underrepresented groups. And that I actually found a bit disturbing. But when she said it, it really resonated with me. How often do you try to make the point? Do you show the data and someone says, nope, not my reality, I don't believe that. I don't believe women of color have it any worse than anybody else. What are you talking about? It's just because you knew, or it's just because you study in that particular area and nobody wants to collaborate with you because that's not a hot area right now. So this idea of the lack of authenticity of the message and who the messenger is really something that is worth recognizing, paying attention to, and combating. Because one last thing about that comment, because one of the points she was making, until there is some recognition of the authenticity of the message, you're not going to get the kind of trust that you need in the people who are positioned to make a difference. So now I want to move to what's next, and I would like to term that and think about that in terms of a call to action for all of us. So these are some things that I was thinking about that are very important to me in terms of what's next. Let's be seen, heard, authentic, resilient, and brave. It is going to take some bravery to continue to push the message, to make sure that there's change, to come together here like we're doing at this conference, and to go out there after the conference and make a difference. The recognition is huge, as I explained to you earlier, not just in terms of identity, but it's just like money gets money, recognition gets recognition. How do you ever get recognized if you don't get recognized in the first place? So those issues are important, and it's very different for women of color than what you see for majority. I mentioned already the power of and the need to tell our own stories. We need to develop leaders. One way you can see change in the academy is to change the leadership. The leadership needs to reflect the population that it serves. Again, we need new models for mentoring. I'm going to repeat it again. It's worth repeating. Be seen, be heard, be authentic, be resilient, and be brave. We've got to break that silence. We've got to have the acceptance of authenticity of the message and the messengers. We need accountability. So what's the point of all this if we don't hold people accountable and if our institutions aren't accountable? And it's not just at the individual level. I think you know from the beginnings of the advanced program, we were talking about, let's not look at it as we have to fix the women. Let's look at how do we fix the institutions, the environments, the cultures. Let's fix that. Let's fix the policies and the practices. I think the women are fine. And let's look at, again, I'm going to repeat that, let's look at what can we do collectively with our allies, but also there is a role, and an important role, for same race and same gender. There's a level of shared understanding when there are shared experiences that there's just no substitute for. We should value that. We should not shy away from it. And I want to say a little bit about self-empowerment. I'm all for empowering ourselves. I tell it to the students all the time. And in this example of self-empowerment I want to give you, it's self-empowerment through self-mentoring. And this is a concept that's been championed very well by one of our own, who will be our keynote speaker at the end of the conference, Sandra McGuire. And so I'm not going to share Sandra's thunder, but I couldn't help but share this with you in terms of something to think about related to mentoring. So Sandra says, well, what do we mean by self-reflective self-mentoring? Because this is something that we can do for ourselves, not as a substitute for, but something that we can do for ourselves. So it's a type of mentoring in which an individual cultivates his or her own professional growth through self-tutoring activities and resource-finding techniques. Self-mentoring requires the individual to be highly motivated and self-disciplined. Nothing wrong with that. The individual increases job effectiveness and augments professional talents by building a body of knowledge and skills without the aid of other people. Congratulations to Sandra for sharing that with us, and you're going to hear more about it. But it really resonated with me when I looked at Sandra's points about self-mentoring and this business about finding your own information. I'm about to end, but I'm going to share one quick story with you. Part of how I got so involved in the social sciences, and I have published some work with psychology professors and professors of public policy around the experience of women of color in the academy. But part of how I got started in the first place, as a junior faculty member at Northeastern University, and everything you could have been the only assistant professor, the only one with a young kid, the only person of color, the only African-American woman, I couldn't have been more isolated. And I thought, how am I going to navigate this? I wasn't finding mentors. I wasn't finding anyone I could talk to. There weren't other women. It turned out for a while I was the most senior woman many parts of my career. So I turned to the social science literature. I started reading about organizational literature, behaviors, men, women, gendered, racial. And the more I read, the more I understood. And so I would try some of the things out on my colleagues in meetings. I started observing their behaviors and taking notes on it. And I can't tell you how empowered I felt. Like, I didn't feel like I could change the whole academy. I couldn't change my whole department. But I had some knowledge, and I understood, and it would tickle me so in a faculty meeting when I could point out some behaviors that I had just read about. And it actually did help me. And it helped me when I was working with other women coming behind me and other women of color in particular. It's like, listen, there's some social science about this. And here's how we can use this to our benefit. So I really wanted to share that with you. And the last thing I wanted to share with you is don't lose your sense of humor. When all else fails, take a laugh, lighten up. Langston Hughes is my favorite author, and I constantly refer back to his stories. But I thought about it. Why am I so drawn to Langston Hughes? I was so drawn to Langston Hughes because he made fun of everything. And he would take, I mean, how depressing the civil rights movements or you know, the inequities, it just so depressing. And he would find the humor in these depressing stories, and I would read his stories and end up just laughing. So I'm going to just share with you what I turn to and thank Langston Hughes for. And humor. So humor is laughing at what you haven't got when you ought to have it. Thank you very much.